The roar of Jake Malone's Harley-Davidson cut through the stillness of the South Dakota plains as he approached Sturgis, the legendary biker rally that drew thousands each year. He'd been waiting a lifetime to feel this wind, the unrestrained freedom of riding for hours with nothing but the road beneath him. Yet, as he neared Sturgis, a sense of unease clouded his thoughts. This wasn't just any journey. For Jake, this was a pilgrimage, a chance to confront a part of himself he'd avoided for far too long. Jake was no ordinary man. He was a mountain of muscle and strength, a seasoned strongman who had spent over a decade in competitions, lifting weights that would break the bones of most. But despite his physical power, Jake's memories were haunted by the emotional scars of his youth. Back then, he was the awkward giant, the target of cruel jokes from classmates who sneered and mocked him behind his back, or worse, to his face. Those words were etched into his soul, even after years of proving his physical dominance. Now, at 35, Jake was a picture of stoicism, his towering frame adorned with tattoos that told stories only he could understand. He was used to the stares his size invited, but the weight of those looks had never lightened, never let him feel at ease in his own skin. This journey was supposed to be about the bike, about the Harley he'd finally been able to afford after years of scraping and saving. But deep down, Jake knew this was about proving something to himself, facing those old wounds one last time. Sturgis had always represented a sense of freedom and acceptance in Jake's mind. He imagined it as a sanctuary where all kinds of people could come together and shed the judgments of society. As he rolled into town, surrounded by hundreds of other bikers in leather and denim, he hoped that the rough exterior was just a shield like his own. Maybe here, he'd find a kindred spirit or two, someone who looked past his size and saw the man beneath. But as soon as he parked his Harley and took off his helmet, he felt the familiar sting of judgmental stares. Some eyes lingered a bit too long, and he heard a couple of muffled laughs. It was like he'd stepped back into his teenage years when his size had been a curse rather than a strength. The thought gnawed at him. Were they laughing at him? Or was he projecting his insecurities? He walked through the crowd, doing his best to ignore the glances and muttered comments. But the more he tried to brush them off, the more they seemed to follow him. He recalled the ridicule, the whispers of giant freak that had once pushed him into his shell. Jake thought he'd left that kid behind, buried under years of grueling physical training and competition. But here he was, feeling just as exposed and out of place as he had all those years ago. By the time night fell, Jake was exhausted. He'd planned to spend his first night in Sturgis soaking in the camaraderie of the biker crowd, reveling in the community he'd longed to join. But he felt as isolated as ever. The roar of laughter and the sight of bikers clinking their glasses, lost in their own stories, reminded him of his own loneliness. The sense of freedom he'd craved seemed as distant as ever. As he walked back to his hotel, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. It wasn't the stairs alone that bothered him. It was the fact that he was here at last, among people he thought would be his tribe, yet he felt like he'd walked into enemy territory. Jake looked down at his tattooed arms, each inked image a testament to battles he'd fought and won, but none of it could shield him from the bitterness of isolation. What if, he wondered, this loneliness was something he could never escape, no matter where he went? The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the empty road ahead. Jake stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath as he gazed at the distant lights of Sturgis glowing against the night sky. "It's just the first day," he muttered to himself, willing himself to believe it. He hadn't traveled all this way to turn back now. The dream of riding to Sturgis had kept him going through countless hard days, and he wasn't about to let a few stares and whispers tear it down. But as he turned away, a nagging feeling gnawed at him, warning him that this was more than just first-day nerves. For the first time in years, Jake felt something he had buried deep down, a sharp, acidic doubt that left a bitter taste in his mouth. He wanted to believe that Sturgis would be a place of acceptance, where people were free to be who they were, free from labels. But here he was, haunted by a fear he thought he'd defeated. As he walked toward his hotel, he glanced back at the festivities, the loud, lively crowd, each laugh feeling like a slap, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, he didn't belong here. Jake took a deep breath, gripping his bike keys tightly as he reached the door of his hotel room. Tomorrow would be different, he told himself. Tomorrow, he'd prove that he belonged in Sturgis, that this was his world too. He'd find his way through the crowd, talk to some of the other bikers, and break through the invisible walls that seemed to separate him from the rest. The old fears, the laughter from his past, they wouldn't follow him forever. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't ignore the sense that something more ominous was waiting for him in Sturgis, something beyond the stares and whispers. A tension hung in the air, a warning that he was walking into a storm that could tear open wounds he wasn't ready to face. The morning sun cast a harsh glow on the streets of Sturgis, pulling Jake from the uneasy sleep he'd managed to get. Determined to shake off the discomfort of the previous night, he headed to his Harley in the hotel parking lot, ready to put yesterday behind him and embrace the day with a renewed sense of purpose. But when he caught sight of his bike, he froze. The sleek, custom-painted side of his Harley was scratched up, ugly words gouged into the metal. Outsider. Wannabe. His stomach clenched, and a surge of anger prickled his skin. He took a breath, forcing himself to stay calm as he ran his hand over the words, feeling each hateful groove under his fingers. Jake immediately thought of the gang he'd noticed last night. The Corvos, a group known for their exclusivity and hostility toward newcomers. They were the self-appointed gatekeepers of Sturgis, and he'd seen them eyeing him when he'd rolled into town. He hadn't paid much attention to them at the time, but now he wished he had. The thought of confronting them flared his temper, but he pushed the urge aside. Getting into a fight would only feed into what they wanted. As he wiped at the scratches with a rag, he felt the burn of stares. Looking up, he saw a few of the Corvos members lounging by their bikes, grinning as they watched him. Their eyes gleamed with a mix of amusement and contempt. The leader, Buck, a wiry man with a wild beard and hard eyes, nodded toward Jake with a smirk, as if daring him to react. Jake clenched his jaw, suppressing his anger as he gave Buck a cold look before turning back to his bike. The last thing he wanted was to stoop to their level, to give them the satisfaction of rattling him. But as he worked on his Harley, he could feel their gazes piercing his back, like a pack of wolves sizing up prey. Throughout the day, Jake found himself constantly under their watch. The Corvos trailed him silently as he moved through the crowd, their stares and smug chuckles an ever-present shadow. Every so often, one of them would brush past him, muttering snide comments just loud enough for him to hear. "Big guy with no guts," one sneered. Another chuckled, "He's all brawn, no brains." Jake did his best to ignore them, biting down on his frustration. But each taunt clawed at the insecurities he'd carried for years, dragging him back to the days when his strength and size had been mocked rather than respected. He'd worked so hard to build himself up, to prove that he was more than just a big, awkward kid. But now, with every taunt, the gang chipped away at that hard-won confidence. By afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. The Corvos had escalated from snide comments to outright confrontation. Buck approached Jake in a crowded beer tent, his voice dripping with mockery as he looked him up and down. "Didn't think a city giant like you would be brave enough to come out here," Buck sneered, crossing his arms as he looked around, encouraging his gang to laugh. "Or maybe you're just lost." Jake met Buck's gaze, his own expression hardening as he refused to be intimidated. He squared his shoulders, not backing down, but not taking the bait either. "I belong here as much as anyone else," Jake replied, his voice calm but firm. Buck's smirk widened. "Is that so?" He stepped closer, almost toe-to-toe with Jake. "See, the thing is, around here, we don't like posers. And you," Buck jabbed a finger into Jake's chest, just enough to test him. "You're nothing but a big body with no guts." The touch sparked a surge of fury inside Jake, but he forced himself to hold back. He could feel every muscle in his body coiling, a spring on the verge of snapping. But he wouldn't let Buck or his gang have that victory. Clenching his fists, he took a slow, measured breath, willing himself to stay in control. "Better watch where you're pointing that finger, Buck," Jake said in a low, warning tone. Buck chuckled, backing away with his hands raised in mock surrender, but the spark of mischief in his eyes told Jake that this was far from over. Jake watched him go, his fists still clenched, his heart pounding with restrained anger. Later that evening, as he tried to find a quiet spot to unwind, Jake noticed Buck and the Corvos shadowing him again. They moved through the crowd like wraiths, keeping their distance but never letting him out of their sight. Their intent was clear. They were waiting, baiting him into a reaction, waiting for him to slip, to lash out so they could brand him as a troublemaker. Jake tried to lose himself among the crowds, but the Corvos were relentless. Finally, one of them shoved him from behind as he was passing a row of parked bikes. Jake stumbled forward, catching himself just before he hit the pavement. The group laughed, jeering as Buck stepped forward. "You've got all that muscle, but no fight in you, huh, big man?" Buck taunted, loud enough for nearby bikers to hear. "Just like I thought. Nothing but a lumbering oaf." Jake took a step back, steadying himself. But the laughter, the ridicule, it was as if he'd been transported back to his teenage years, surrounded by jeering faces, powerless to fight back without confirming their image of him as the brutish giant. His fists ached with the need to strike, his body tense with the urge to defend himself. But he forced himself to turn away, to walk toward his Harley, hoping they would lose interest. But as he swung his leg over the bike and revved the engine, he saw the Corvos mount their own bikes, laughter still ringing in the air. They had no intention of letting him go. Jake felt a chill settle over him, a warning that this was only the beginning. As he pulled onto the road, he glimpsed Buck and his crew following close behind, their engines roaring as they tailed him out of town. The open road stretched before him, dark and empty, but Jake knew that he couldn't outrun them. The Corvos weren't just looking for a scare, they wanted a fight. And as the town lights faded in his mirrors, Jake braced himself for the storm that was about to come. Jake's Harley tore through the darkness as he sped down a winding road away from the main strip of Sturgis. He hoped the open stretch would put enough distance between him and the Corvos, but their bikes kept close, the roar of their engines merging with the howling wind. His mind raced, weighing his options. He'd come to Sturgis seeking camaraderie, a place to finally belong. Instead, he'd walked right into a trap. He reached an isolated stretch of highway bordered by rugged hills, and as he rounded a bend, he glimpsed a narrow, deserted dirt road leading toward an abandoned gravel lot. Thinking quickly, Jake swerved onto it, hoping the rough terrain would slow his pursuers. But the Corvos followed, their headlights slicing through the shadows as they closed in. The road opened up into a wide gravel clearing surrounded by dense trees, with no sign of escape. Jake knew he couldn't outrun them here. It was time to face them, head-on. He killed the engine and swung his leg off the bike, planting his feet firmly on the uneven ground. The Corvos rode up and parked in a semicircle around him, blocking any way out. Buck dismounted last, striding toward him with that familiar mocking grin. Behind Buck, the gang spread out, each face set in an expression of contempt or eager anticipation. Jake's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his gaze steady, his fists relaxed by his sides. He wouldn't let them see him flinch. "Well, well," Buck sneered, circling Jake like a predator sizing up prey. "The big man's finally ready to play. Thought you'd keep running forever." Jake held his ground, his voice calm but edged with warning. "I'm done running. You got something to say? Say it." Buck's smirk deepened. "You don't belong here, Malone. Sturgis isn't for guys like you, weak inside, all muscle and no heart. We're here to show you exactly where you stand." He gestured to his crew, who closed in, leaving Jake nowhere to turn. Jake assessed his surroundings with a practiced eye. He wasn't in a competition arena now. There was no referee, no rules to hold anyone back. He was outnumbered and cornered, but he knew brute force alone wouldn't save him. He'd need to be strategic, use the environment to his advantage. As one of the bikers lunged toward him, Jake pivoted, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it sharply, sending him sprawling into the gravel. Before another could react, Jake moved toward a large rock near the edge of the clearing. He felt a surge of energy as he calculated his next move. When two more of Buck's men charged at him, he dodged and pushed them toward each other, using their own momentum to knock them off balance. But the Corvos weren't giving up that easily. From his peripheral vision, Jake saw Buck swinging a chain, the metal links glinting under the moonlight. The leader's face twisted with fury as he lashed out, aiming for Jake's ribs. Jake raised his arm to block the blow, the chain biting into his forearm, pain searing through his muscles. "Is that all you got?" Jake grunted, masking the pain with a smirk. The taunt only fueled Buck's anger. Another biker lunged, attempting to tackle him from behind, but Jake sidestepped, grabbing the man's jacket and using his own weight to throw him to the ground. Jake's movements were fluid and calculated. Every action was designed not to waste energy. He couldn't afford to tire out with the odds so heavily stacked against him. The Corvos regrouped, anger flashing in their eyes. Buck advanced, his expression darker now, his pride clearly bruised. "Not so tough without your muscles, huh? Come on, show us what you're really made of, Malone." Jake exhaled, keeping his focus sharp. He scanned the ground, noting a broken bottle half buried in the dirt. With a quick movement, he scooped it up, gripping the jagged glass as he prepared to defend himself. Another gang member lunged, and Jake used the bottle's edge to parry, shoving his assailant back. But the fight was taking its toll. Blood trickled from a cut on his cheek, and his muscles burned with fatigue. The Corvos pressed their advantage, sensing his exhaustion. One of them landed a blow to his ribs, sending a shock of pain up his side. Jake staggered, struggling to stay upright as the world spun around him. He couldn't let them overwhelm him. Drawing on the last of his strength, Jake focused on Buck, knowing that if he could take down their leader, the others might back off. With a final burst of energy, Jake lunged forward, grabbing Buck by the collar and yanking him off balance. The two grappled, each man straining against the other's weight. Buck swung a fist, but Jake ducked, countering with a powerful jab to the side. Buck stumbled, his grip weakening. Sensing his chance, Jake pushed him back, using his own momentum to throw Buck to the ground. He twisted Buck's arm behind his back, forcing him to the gravel as the gang looked on in shock. Panting, Jake met the gang's stunned gazes, his voice hard as steel. "Anyone else want to try me?" The Corvos hesitated, exchanging uncertain looks. Jake could see the doubt in their eyes. Without Buck leading the charge, their confidence faltered. One by one, they took a step back, their bravado fading as they realized they'd underestimated their target. Finally, Buck groaned, his face pressed into the dirt as he struggled in Jake's grip. All right, Malone. You win. Get off me." Jake released him, stepping back as Buck pushed himself up, his expression a mix of fury and humiliation. He dusted himself off, meeting Jake's gaze with a bitter scowl. But there was something else in his eyes now, a flicker of respect, grudging but undeniable. Without another word, Buck nodded to his crew, signaling them to back off. They mounted their bikes, casting wary glances at Jake as they revved their engines and peeled out of the gravel lot, leaving him alone in the silence of the night. Jake watched them go, the adrenaline slowly fading from his system. His body ached, his breaths came in ragged gasps, but he was still standing. He'd faced the worst they had to throw at him, and he hadn't broken. For the first time, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, a quiet, hard-earned victory that went beyond physical strength. Alone in the darkness, Jake looked up at the sky, his mind surprisingly calm. He hadn't come to Sturgis looking for a fight, but he'd found something deeper, a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. Jake leaned against his Harley, catching his breath and wiping the blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. The silence of the night felt strange after the chaos that had just unfolded. He was bruised and battered, but he had held his ground. He looked down at his fists, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. For once, the battle wasn't just against the men around him, It was against the doubt that had shadowed him his entire life. As he stood alone in the gravel lot, the low rumble of approaching engines reached his ears. His body tensed, bracing for another attack. But as the bikes came into view, he recognized some of the faces from the rally earlier in the day. Bikers who'd been in the crowd, onlookers to the Corvo's taunts. Jake hadn't expected them to follow him out here, but as they dismounted and approached him with wary glances, he sensed a shift in the air. One of them, a grizzled man with silver hair tied back in a ponytail, stepped forward, holding out a red bandana. "Here," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "You're bleeding. Looks like you had yourself a hell of a fight." Jake hesitated, then took the bandana, pressing it to his cut. He studied the group of men and women around him, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity. He'd felt like an outsider from the moment he'd arrived, but now, under the moonlight, their eyes seemed less judgmental, as if they'd seen something in him they hadn't expected. The older biker introduced himself as Tom, nodding approvingly as he looked Jake up and down. "Word got around that Buck and his gang had it out for you," Tom said, crossing his arms. "Didn't think you'd last against them, to be honest. They're notorious around here for running off newcomers who don't fit their standards. Guess you showed them." Jake managed a slight smile, wincing as he did. "Didn't exactly come here looking for trouble," he replied, his voice rough from the fight. "Just wanted to ride, maybe find a place I could belong for a change." A woman with a streak of bright purple in her hair scoffed, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Guess you found it now, huh? Buck won't be harassing you again anytime soon. Most people who've gone against him haven't come out standing." She extended a hand. "Name's Lisa. And in case you haven't noticed, not everyone in Sturgis is like those idiots." Jake shook her hand, nodding. There was a warmth in her tone, a sense of camaraderie he hadn't felt in years. One by one, the other bikers introduced themselves, offering words of respect for his stand against the Corvos. Their gestures, small as they were, lifted a weight off his shoulders he hadn't realized he was carrying. Tom clapped Jake on the shoulder, guiding him back to his bike. "Why don't you ride with us back into town? Consider it a welcome. Sturgis might have its share of bad apples, but most of us, we're just here for the ride, for the freedom." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of acceptance he hadn't expected. As they mounted their bikes and roared back toward town, he felt the thrill of belonging ripple through him. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was on the outside looking in. When they reached the main strip, the crowds from earlier had thinned, but word of the fight had already spread. Bikers nodded at him as he passed, murmuring in low voices, and he caught snippets of their admiration. "That's the guy who took on Buck, and didn't think anyone had the guts to stand up to the Corvos." It was strange, almost surreal. Jake had spent so many years believing he'd never be accepted, that his size would always keep people at arm's length. But now, here he was, finally part of something larger than himself. He parked his bike near a bar, where a few other bikers had gathered, and dismounted, feeling the throbbing aches from his cuts and bruises. Inside the bar, Jake was greeted with nods and claps on the back. Someone handed him a beer, and he raised it in a quiet toast, feeling a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. The camaraderie was palpable, the laughter and stories filling the air, and for once he felt like he was part of it, not just a spectator. He sat at a table with Tom, Lisa, and a few of the others who had come to his aid, listening as they recounted tales of their own battles on the road. They told him about times they'd had to defend themselves against gangs like the Corvos, times they'd been tested and had come out stronger. Jake found himself laughing along, the tension in his shoulders melting away. Tom leaned in, his voice a low rumble. "You know, Jake, it's not about the size of the fight. It's about the heart you put into it. You got more of that than most people I know." Jake looked down, a bit uncomfortable with the praise, but grateful. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear those words. "Thanks," he said quietly. "Guess I just wanted to prove something, to myself more than anyone else." Lisa nodded knowingly. Yeah, we all got something we're fighting for. Some kind of redemption, or maybe just acceptance. You're not alone in that. She raised her beer, and Jake clinked his glass against hers, a silent toast to all the battles they'd fought, inside and out. By the end of the night, Jake felt a bond forming with these people, a sense of family he'd longed for but never thought he'd find. As he rose to leave, Tom clapped him on the shoulder once more, a knowing look in his eyes. "Listen," Tom said, "if you ever find yourself out on the road, needing backup, you just holler. You got family here now, Malone." Jake's heart swelled, a feeling of pride mixing with the ache of his bruises. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, meaning every word. As he rode back to his hotel under the vast, starlit sky, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The night air was cool, soothing the cuts and bruises from his battle, and he knew that his journey to Sturgis had brought him more than he'd ever expected. He'd come seeking a place to belong, a place to call his own, and now, after years of fighting his demons alone, he'd finally found his tribe. For the first time, Jake Malone knew he wasn't just a giant on the outside. He was a fighter, someone who'd earned his place, not just among the bikers of Sturgis, but in his own heart. The following morning, Jake woke up to a pounding ache radiating through his muscles, a visceral reminder of the previous night's clash. Every bruise and scrape was like a badge, proof of his survival. But there was a deeper satisfaction under the pain, a sense of victory, of belonging. He was no longer the lone outsider in Sturgis. He had proven himself and earned the respect of people who understood what it took to stand tall in the face of hostility. Jake limped out of his hotel room, making his way to the main strip, where he was greeted by a crowd much larger than before. Word of his fight had spread overnight, and now bikers who'd barely noticed him the day before were looking at him with nods of acknowledgement. He felt their silent approval, the unspoken respect that couldn't be bought or faked. It was earned in sweat and blood, something he understood all too well. As he walked through the crowd, a group of event organizers spotted him and waved him over. They were men and women who had spent decades planning the rally, veterans of countless gatherings. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a silver beard named Ray, stepped forward, extending a hand. Jake shook it, feeling the strength of the man's grip, a strength built on years of hard-won respect. "Jake Malone, right?" Ray's voice was deep, steady, and lined with authority. "Heard about what happened with the Corvos. Not many people would have stood up to Buck and his boys." Jake shrugged, trying to downplay it. "Didn't really have a choice. They were looking for trouble." Ray nodded thoughtfully. "Most guys in your shoes would have backed down, Jake. Sturgis doesn't just give its respect away. You earned yours, and then some." The words sank in, carrying a weight that was both humbling and affirming. Jake had never come to Sturgis looking to prove himself to anyone but himself, yet here he was, being acknowledged by people who'd seen it all. For the first time, he felt as though he belonged not only to the rally but to a legacy of resilience that defined the culture. To Jake's surprise, Ray pulled out a leather patch emblazoned with the rally's emblem, a prestigious badge that only a handful of attendees were given each year, those who'd earned the respect of the Sturgis community. "This here's for you," Ray said, handing him the patch. "Consider it an invitation to return next year as one of our own." Jake accepted the patch, running his fingers over the intricate stitching. His heart swelled with pride. This wasn't a trophy or a medal, but it meant more to him than anything he'd earned in his competitions. It was proof that he'd carved out a place for himself here, not with brute force, but with grit and resolve. The day unfolded in a way Jake had never expected. Bikers approached him one by one, introducing themselves, offering him a drink or a pat on the back. They wanted to hear his story, to know what had driven him to stand up to Buck. Jake shared bits and pieces, feeling a strange freedom as he opened up. He realized that these people understood the scars he bore, both visible and invisible. They'd faced their own battles, struggled with the weight of prejudice, judgment, and the need to prove themselves. A few even shared their own stories of run-ins with the Corvos, recounting how they'd avoided or endured Buck's bullying over the years. To them, Jake's stand had meant more than just a fight. He'd challenged a symbol of oppression within their own community, a courage that resonated with each of them. As the hours passed, Jake found himself surrounded by a growing circle of friends. They were all strangers only a day before, but now they felt like brothers and sisters. They laughed, shared stories, and swapped tales of daring rides and reckless adventures. The camaraderie was thick in the air, weaving him deeper into the fabric of Sturgis. Jake felt lighter, as though he'd finally shrugged off a weight he'd carried for years. In the late afternoon, Jake was approached by Lisa, the woman who had helped him the night before. Her eyes sparkled with pride as she looked him over, noting his bruises with an approving nod. "Looks like you've got the marks of a true Sturgis biker now," she teased. Jake chuckled, rubbing his sore shoulder. "Guess I do. Didn't exactly plan on it, though." Lisa laughed, her voice warm. "Respect isn't something you plan, Jake. It's something you earn without even realizing it. And you earned it more than most." He met her gaze, grateful for her words. "Thanks, Lisa. I never thought I'd find this here, or anywhere, really." She nodded, understanding. Sometimes, the place you feel least likely to belong turns out to be the place you were meant to find. "You're one of us now." Her words lingered with him as the day wore on, filling him with a deep sense of peace. It wasn't just the respect he had gained, it was the acceptance, the unspoken agreement that he belonged here as much as anyone else. He'd fought, he'd earned his scars, and now he was one of them. As night fell, Ray and the other organizers invited him onto a makeshift stage, announcing him as an honorary member of the rally. Cheers erupted from the crowd, the roar of voices and engines blending in a deafening display of approval. Jake looked out at the sea of faces, men and women who'd once seemed like strangers, and felt a surge of pride. He raised his hand, his fingers brushing over the rally patch sewn onto his jacket. 4 years, he'd lifted weights, set records, pushed his body to the limits, yet nothing had ever felt as fulfilling as standing here, surrounded by people who saw him for more than just his size. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I came here to find a place to belong, a place where I could just be myself. You all gave me that and more." The crowd cheered again, and Jake felt a swell of gratitude that words couldn't express. This wasn't just a victory over the Corvos, it was a victory over the years of loneliness and doubt that had shadowed him since his youth. He was finally free of it, no longer weighed down by insecurities. As he stepped down from the stage, friends old and new clapped him on the back, laughing and toasting to his name. He realized that he had come to Sturgis as an outsider, but he would leave as family. When the celebration finally began to wind down, Jake sat by his Harley, looking out over the crowd, his heart full. The scars of his past felt faded, distant memories compared to the friendships and respect he'd found here. The rally, this place, had given him something he'd always searched for, a true sense of belonging. The final morning of the Sturgis rally dawned cool and clear. Jake stood by his Harley, watching as the first rays of sunlight washed over the rows of parked bikes, their polished chrome gleaming in the early light. The town, normally so loud and full of life, was eerily quiet, a calm settling over the landscape as if the earth itself was taking a moment to breathe. It felt like the end of a journey, and the beginning of another. As he packed his gear, Jake's mind replayed the events of the last few days. He'd come to Sturgis alone, uncertain if he'd find acceptance or respect among the tightly knit community of bikers. Instead, he'd found something deeper, a sense of belonging he'd chased his entire life, a feeling of family and respect that ran deeper than blood. His mind drifted to the Corvos, the confrontation, and the hard-earned patch on his jacket, a mark of recognition that he wore with quiet pride. A sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Turning, he saw Tom, the silver-haired biker who had first extended a hand of friendship, striding toward him with a grin. "Heading out?" Tom asked, nodding toward Jake's packed saddlebags. Jake nodded, smiling back. Yeah, thought I'd hit the road before the crowds start up again. Tom extended a hand, his expression thoughtful. Sturgis won't be the same without you, Malone. You got a place here anytime you want it. They shook hands, the warmth of Tom's grip conveying a silent understanding. Jake knew this wasn't just a farewell, it was a promise. He would always have a place to return to, people who'd have his back if he ever needed them. That realization filled him with a profound sense of peace. Lisa approached, her bright purple hair tucked under a bandana, a warm smile spreading across her face. Take care out there, Jake, she said, handing him a small metal pin with a winged skull, an emblem of their group, symbolizing freedom and strength. You're one of us now, officially. Jake took the pin, his fingers closing around it. He felt a lump in his throat, emotions stirring he hadn't expected. Thank you. For everything. Lisa nodded. Thank you, Jake. Not everyone would have stood up to Buck. You did more than just earn respect here. You reminded us of what it means to have courage. The words hung in the air as Jake pinned the emblem onto his jacket, next to the rally patch. He felt like he was adding another piece to a story, a narrative that had been in the making for years. For so long, he had viewed himself as the outsider, the guy who didn't quite fit. But these people had seen him, not as a giant or a strongman, but as one of their own. One by one, other bikers he'd come to know came by to say their goodbyes, each offering a final clap on the back, a handshake, or a nod. Jake soaked it all in, committing every face and every word to memory. This was his family now, even if their paths only crossed once a year at Sturgis. The bonds they'd forged went beyond proximity. They were born of shared battles, mutual respect, and the unbreakable code of the road. Finally, Jake swung his leg over his Harley, revving the engine as the sound echoed down the empty streets. He took a long, deep breath, letting the chill of the morning air fill his lungs. With one last nod to his friends, he pulled out of the parking lot, his bike rumbling steadily as he merged onto the open highway. The miles rolled by, the wind whipping through his hair as he cruised through the vast expanse of the Dakota Plains. As he rode, the landscape shifted from mountains to open prairie, each mile taking him further from Sturgis and closer to home. But this time, he carried something with him that he hadn't brought before, a feeling of peace, of contentment that came from knowing he'd found his place in the world. Jake's mind wandered as he rode, reflecting on how much he'd changed. He thought of the years he'd spent trying to prove his worth to others, as if their judgment defined who he was. He'd competed in strongman contests, lifted unimaginable weights, and built himself into a fortress, yet none of it had filled the void inside him. But in the gritty, rough-edged world of Sturgis, he had found what he'd been searching for all along. Not validation, but acceptance. It wasn't about the respect others showed him. It was about the respect he'd finally granted himself. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jake felt a sense of liberation, like he'd finally let go of the past. The years of carrying that invisible weight, the ridicule from his youth, the feeling of never quite fitting in, had vanished, replaced by a newfound confidence that came from within. He didn't need to be accepted by the world. He only needed to accept himself. He rode on for hours, letting the bike carry him forward as he took in the beauty of the open road. Every mile brought him closer to home, yet he knew that wherever he traveled, he would carry the spirit of Sturgis with him. The strength he'd found there, the camaraderie, the brotherhood, it was a part of him now, woven into his very soul. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Jake pulled over at a scenic overlook, the endless stretch of highway visible below. He switched off the engine and sat quietly, watching as the colors faded into twilight. In the silence, he thought of his friends back at Sturgis, their laughter and stories echoing in his mind like a song he'd never forget. In that moment, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new journey. He'd continue to ride, to push himself, to meet new people and face new challenges. But he was no longer searching for a place to belong. He had found it within himself. With a deep breath, Jake climbed back onto his Harley, the sky darkening around him as stars began to dot the heavens. He revved the engine one last time, the sound filling the air with a steady, powerful rhythm, and pulled back onto the road. As he rode into the night, Jake felt the weight of his past drift away, leaving only the open road and the promise of the miles ahead. He was finally free, a true man of the road, carrying with him the strength he'd always had but only just discovered. And with that, he disappeared into the vast horizon, his heart light and his spirit unbreakable, ready for whatever awaited him down the line.